Hey friends, I talk on here a lot about sourdough baking, and some of you, when I tell that to you, you're like, what is a sourdough starter? So here is my explanation of what a sourdough starter is, why you need one, and how to take care of it. So this is my sourdough starter. It is a mix of flour and water. And it also has naturally occurring yeasts and bacteria in it. Now those yeasts and bacteria are going to help ferment your bread. Basically they take fresh flour and water, those all mixed together into a dough with some of the sourdough starter, and that helps it form the bubbles inside the bread to get you that nice open airy bread texture, so that your bread is soft instead of being a hard brick, which is what it pretty much would be if you didn't have any sort of leavening agent. That's what a sourdough starter is. It's a type of leavening agent. Leavening meaning something that gets the bread or grain product, baked good, to rise. So what you want to do with this is feed it. You have to feed it. If you keep it on the counter, you can feed it about every 12 to 24 hours, depending on how active it is and how warm your room is. Or if you keep it in the fridge, which is what I recommend because most of us don't need to be baking quite that much, then you can feed it once a week. So when you put it in the fridge, the yeasts are still alive, but they do get a little sleepy, so it may take a couple feedings for it to get back to its full potential. Now this sourdough starter has been in the fridge for a week, maybe a little bit longer, so it's hungry. As you can see, there's a little grayish blackish line on the top. That is a liquid. It is called hooch, and it is what is formed when your sourdough starter gets really hungry, when it hasn't been fed in a while. If you smell it, it smells kind of like alcohol, because it's just a byproduct of fermentation that eventually slowly rises to the top when you leave your sourdough starter alone for a long period of time. So I don't know if you can see that there, but that is just a little bit of hooch. It is normal and perfectly okay. Some people stir it back in, but it smells pretty alcohol-y, so I usually pour mine out. So I'm going to go do that real quick. So there you go. All I did was pour it off the top. This sourdough starter is thick enough that it didn't really pour much, so I could just pour that hooch right off the top. And now what do? So I keep mine in a mason jar, and that is for a reason. Number one, I can see what's going on in there and see how much is in it. And it's also compact, nice and compact for storing in the fridge or wherever. But also, one of the other benefits is it has these gradations on the side that tells you at least the approximate volume for feeding your sourdough. So this tells me that I have about somewhere between 1 cup and 1.5 cups of sourdough starter, probably closer to 1.5 cups. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to round up. So since I have closer to 1.5 cups, I'm going to round it up to 1.5 cups, and I'm going to feed it that same volume of flour and water. Now, some people have said you can feed it either by volume or by weight, meaning you can feed it using a measuring cup and measuring out the number of cups, or you can put it on a kitchen scale and weigh the number of grams that you have and do that. Now, I have found that it produces, with my freshly ground whole wheat flour, it produces a sourdough starter that's really super thick, really hard to mix, and that's going to change your recipes. So for me, I feed it by volume. I find that that gives me a better result. But you can always experiment with it. If that doesn't work for you, find something else that does. I'm going to go ahead and feed this because I want to mix bread dough tonight and bake tomorrow. So let's get started. Apron first. All right, now I'm all protected. So first things first, I am going to transfer it to a bigger container because once I add 1.5 cups of flour and 1.5 cups of water to the sourdough starter, it's going to overflow this jar. So I do switch the container out every couple weeks, or more often as needed. So this is just a clear plastic Tupperware container. I'm going to switch it into that so it has room to expand, because after I mix it together, it's actually going to double in volume over the course of a few hours. So I want to give it plenty of space to do what it's going to do. So I'm using the big container because I bake a lot because I have 4 kids to feed. Grabbing one of my favorite baking tools, which is the long stainless steel spoon with the small spoon on the end. I love these for scraping out jars like this. So here we go. You can see how the appropriate texture for sourdough starter is pretty gloopy. It's the best adjective that I have for it. Okay, our next step is to add the flour, and I already mentioned that I'm going to add 1.5 cups of flour because I have maybe 1.25 cups of sourdough starter and I want to round up. When you're feeding your sourdough starter, you can always round up in the measurements of flour and water that you add. You'll want to keep the amount of flour and water that you add the same as each other. But that could be a little bit more than the sourdough starter that you have. But you never want to feed it less because that would be like underfeeding it. You don't want a super hungry sourdough starter to bake with. You want one that's happy and well fed and growing. So I've got my 1/2 cup measuring cup. I'm going to do 3 scoops here. Now this is fresh home ground flour, home ground whole wheat flour. The variety of wheat grains that I use is hard red wheat. You can use whatever variety you want. You don't even have to use wheat at all. You can use other grains, whatever you like. It's really up to you. The important thing is make sure that you choose a grain and keep it consistent with each feeding. So the sourdough starter isn't going to like it if one day you use hard red wheat, and the next day you use hard white wheat, and the next day you use spelt or kamut or einkorn, or you use white flour. It's not going to like all those changes. If you want to change it over to another type of flour, you can, but do it slowly and gradually over several feedings so that it gets used to that new type of flour and it gets trained for that. If you suddenly switch it, it's probably not going to be bubbly, and it's going to take a few feedings anyway to get used to the new type of flour and to get fully back to its normal bubbly state. So just transition slowly if you decide to do that. But otherwise, I've always fed mine hard red wheat. I never changed it. So keep it the same and you'll have a healthy starter. Your next step is to add some filtered water. The water, you want to make sure that the water you add is filtered and has chlorine and fluoride removed as much as possible, because those two things will kill a lot of the yeast and bacteria in it. It'll make your sourdough starter a lot less bubbly, and your breads will be more dense and hard rather than soft and fluffy. So you want to filter those out. Not to mention that fluoride isn't really something that we want to consume anyway, but that's beside the point. The point is, it will kill your sourdough starter, so try to avoid that. I like my zero water filter, but you can also use a Berkey or buy filtered water. Alright, so here we go. We've got our filtered water. I used my zero water filter to filter this water, and I've got 1.5 cups, so the same measurement as the flour that I added is how much water I add in measuring by volume. So I'm going to go ahead and add this in, and then we'll go ahead and mix up the flour, water, and sourdough starter all together. That's really all that your sourdough starter is. So here we go, and this is using one of my favorite baking tools again, this long spoon. I don't know why, I just really love this. It's very versatile, and I've got 6 of them, so if I use one, I can just use another, and I can just throw them in the dishwasher. Super easy. So you can see that this sourdough starter mixed up really easily by hand, and it is at a certain level right now. So if you're ever not sure if your sourdough starter is actually rising, what you can do is use a dry erase marker directly on the outside of your container, make a line and then watch it grow. You can also put a rubber band around it or whatever you like, but I always have trouble finding a rubber band that fits. So I like the dry erase marker because that's just what works for me. I honestly don't use it most of the time, and I just trust my sourdough starter at this point. But when you're first starting out, especially if you're trying to make your own sourdough starter, you'll want to make the line and see if it's doubling. Alright, so here we have our dry erase marker. Let's make a little line right at the level of the sourdough starter. Now, the other thing that you'll notice is that I scraped down the sides of my container as much as I could, and that is because we don't want the container to be to have lots of sourdough starter caked on the sides. The reason for that being where the sourdough starter is more exposed to air, in my personal experience, I've noticed that is where it tends to get moldy, especially if you leave it for a longer period of time than you're supposed to. So in order to avoid that, I just try to keep the sides as clean as possible. Obviously, it's not perfect, but I just try to minimize that and make sure that it doesn't have too much excess opportunity to grow mold. So if your sourdough starter happens to get moldy, here's what you can do. Scrape off the mold that will be probably on the top of the sourdough starter. Rinse off your spoon each time you go back in, so that it doesn't contaminate the sourdough starter underneath too much. And then once you've got that scraped off enough that you can pull some of that clean sourdough starter out from underneath, you'll take your clean spoon, scoop out a little bit of it. Maybe just a tablespoon is all you really need. And then feed that tablespoon a few times. Let it grow again over, a few days. And if it does grow mold again, then you should probably throw it out. It wouldn't be salvageable in that case. But if it doesn't grow mold, then you're good to go. You've avoided having to start over your sourdough starter. So all is not lost. But you'll want to make sure that you never use all of your sourdough starter for any recipe. You always want to save back a little bit, even if it's just the scrapings from the jar that you're keeping it in. Save back a little bit so that you can use it again in the next recipe and keep feeding it and keep growing it. So there are some people who've kept the same sourdough starter for hundreds or even 1,000 years. At least that's what they claim, passed down from generation to generation. So a sourdough starter really can last that long if you're keeping up with it and your family's using it, for generations. So you just want to keep it going, keep it going. Basically, you've got a new pet now, but your pet's going to reward you with bread, dinner rolls, bagels, hamburger buns, hot dog buns, cinnamon rolls, whatever you can think of to bake with any sort of yeast. You can make a sourdough version of it. So that's super fun. It is a very rewarding hobby in terms of you get to eat your creations, but also you get to learn new skills, and it's improving your health as well. Sourdough is really great for fertility. It makes things more digestible, helps with inflammation, which all of that will help with fertility and with general health in life. So it's a great hobby to learn, and I encourage it. Once you're done feeding your sourdough starter, you just want to put a lid on it. Now, I have noticed some people say, don't put a lid on, or keep the lid loose on your sourdough starter because you want to get yeast from the air. In my experience, you're more likely to get mold from the air. The yeast is really coming from the grain itself. It is, I believe, and based on my experience, the yeast is just on the grain. So you really don't need to get wild yeast from the air. That's not really where most of the yeast is coming from. It's coming from the grain itself. So don't worry about keeping your container closed, keeping a lid on that's airtight. It's completely fine. Keep that lid on, make it airtight. Your sourdough starter yeast is coming from inside. So you don't need to catch the mold or whatever else is growing in the air to get it to make your bread rise. That's my opinion and my experience. So where are you going to leave this? We don't put it back in the fridge right away because then it won't really rise, or it'll rise really slowly. We leave it either out on the counter, or if you want to, you can put it in the oven. Like if it's winter or if it's a cold day and your kitchen is pretty cold, what you do is leave it in the oven, but don't turn the oven on, just turn the oven light on. It'll get to about 80 degrees or so, which is perfect for your sourdough starter. You really don't want it over 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit because that'll kill off or slow down your yeast. So about 80 degrees will make it go pretty fast, and then your sourdough starter will be ready to bake with at whatever time you need. So usually it takes about 6 to 8 hours for the sourdough starter to really rise. I don't really see it rising much until about the 4 to 5 hour mark, maybe even past that. It seems, in my experience, that my sourdough starter mostly rises in the second half of the rise portion. So don't freak out if you're not seeing it rise in the first 4 hours. It probably won't. It probably takes time for it to work through all of the flour and consume that, and then eventually it'll start producing those bubbles. It'll bubble up and rise, and then it should double or more in volume. When it gets to the top, it'll have a peak, and then after that, if you don't use it, or if you do, it will start to go back down. Slowly, but it will start to go back down. So there is an ideal point. You want to use it to bake with in a recipe right about at the peak. But if you miss that by an hour on either side, it's not going to hurt anything. If you miss it by 2 or 3 hours, you can still bake with it. It just won't be quite as fluffy, but it's completely fine. I do it all the time because my goal isn't perfect bread. It's done bread, an edible bread. And, we do that pretty well. Everybody loves the bread in this family. So, good enough is good enough. So don't let the pursuit of perfection chase out the good that you can still do if you miss the peak time for your sourdough starter. But if you are looking for that perfect bread, you're entering a sourdough competition or whatever other crazy things you're doing and you really want to nail it, then use it right at that peak and make that your goal. So I'm going to stick this on my counter today because it's a warm enough day and I've got enough time. And then we'll check it again tonight after I put my children to bed. I'm feeding my sourdough starter right now at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So that would be pretty typical. And my sourdough starter will be ready to bake whenever I am, which is usually between 8 to 10 p.m. I will go ahead and mix the dough tonight, and then I will bake in the morning. We'll do all the other steps that we need to do. So that is the process. That's how you take care of it. That's what you do with it. That's what it's for. Okay, so it is about 9:40 at night after I've fed the sourdough starter. Now, keep in mind, the sourdough starter has been in the fridge for over a week, and so it's pretty sleepy. So you can see, based on my line, that it has risen some, but it has not doubled, which we're going to say that's okay. You can still get a bread that will rise and will taste good, even if your sourdough starter is a little sleepy. Would I prefer it to be fully active? Yes. Am I going to bother to feed it twice before I make bread? No, because that's a lot for me. So this is good enough, and we're going to bake with it. So all I have to do is take the lid off. You can see the bubbles there that are coming up, which is a good sign, and it'll smell like kind of like yeast, basically, because that's what it is. But if you ever have smelled a yeasty bread, which all of us have, it'll smell yeasty. What we're going to do now is use our kitchen scale, and I will put that there. We get our mixing bowl, whatever we're going to use, doesn't matter. Use what you have, and then I'm going to tare that so that it zeroes out, so it won't measure the weight of the bowl. It will just measure the weight of what you put inside it. So, and then for this particular recipe that I'm going to make, I'm going to need about 160 grams. So all I do is just pour that straight into the bowl, Whenever it reaches 160 grams, we stop. And let's see, we're at 140. 155. Just a little more. 160. Okay, so that's it. I've got this here, which I can also use for other recipes. If you're going to feed it again multiple times, but you want to use it, make sure that you use your sourdough starter before you feed it again. Otherwise, you'll need to wait another 8 hours. So that's how you use sourdough starter. I can add my flour, my water. You know, this is going to be an enriched dough, so it's going to have eggs and milk and all that good stuff in there. I mix it up and then I'll leave it overnight and bake with it tomorrow. So that's your sourdough starter basics. I hope you enjoyed that and that was helpful for you. Give it a like if that was helpful for you. Save it for later so that you can come back and refer to it again as you need to. And follow for more information on God's design for fertility, nutrition, and sexuality. Much love and God bless.